Sometimes the people who change your life are the ones the world has already forgotten. The wind carried the scent of fallen leaves across the small park on the edge of Brooklyn as Claire Dawson hurried along the cracked concrete path with a paper cup of coffee warming her hands. It was barely 7 in the morning. The sky glowed pale gold behind rows of aging maple trees, and the city seemed caught in that rare moment between silence and noise. Most people walked through the park without looking up. They stared at their phones, rushed towards subway stations, or disappeared into the rhythm of another workday. But Claire noticed things. She noticed the loose swing moving slightly in the breeze. She noticed the old groundskeeper sweeping leaves into careful piles. And for the 3rd morning in a row, she noticed the elderly woman sitting alone on the same wooden bench beneath the largest maple tree. The woman wore a navy coat despite the mild weather. Her silver hair was neatly brushed. Her hands rested quietly in her lap. She wasn't reading. She wasn't using a phone. She wasn't feeding birds. She simply sat there looking toward the pond as if she were waiting for someone who never came. Claire slowed her pace. Yesterday she had told herself it wasn't her business. The day before that, she had thought the same thing. But something about the woman's loneliness stayed with her long after she left the park. By the time Claire finished her shift at the assisted living center every evening, she found herself wondering whether the woman had ever gone home. The next morning, curiosity finally won. She crossed the grass and approached the bench. "Good morning," she said with a polite smile. The woman turned slowly. Her blue eyes were bright despite the deep lines around them. "Good morning, dear." Her voice carried warmth that immediately softened the distance between strangers. "You sit here every day," Claire said. The woman smiled. "And you walk by every day." Claire laughed quietly. "Fair enough." For several minutes they talked about simple things, the weather, the changing leaves, the coffee shop across the street, nothing important. Yet somehow the conversation felt strangely comfortable, as though they were continuing a discussion that had been interrupted years ago. When Claire finally checked the time, she realized she was running late. "I should go." "Of course," the woman said. "Thank you for stopping." The words lingered with Claire as she walked away. Thank you for stopping. Such a simple sentence, yet it sounded like something the woman rarely had reason to say. Over the next 2 weeks, the encounters became routine. Every morning, same bench, same tree, same gentle smile. Claire learned the woman's name was Eleanor. Eleanor never spoke much about family. She never mentioned visitors. She never complained. But sometimes Claire noticed the way her eyes drifted toward the park entrance whenever a black car passed nearby, as if part of her expected someone to arrive. One chilly Thursday morning, Claire arrived carrying an extra coffee. Eleanor looked genuinely surprised. "You remembered how I take it." "1 cream, no sugar." "That's impressive." Claire shrugged. "Occupational hazard." Eleanor laughed softly. The sound seemed to brighten the entire bench. Then suddenly the laughter stopped. Her expression changed. Her hand tightened around the coffee cup. For a brief second, the color drained from her face. Claire immediately knelt beside her. "Eleanor," the older woman tried to answer, but her voice faded into the wind. The cup slipped from her fingers and rolled across the concrete path. Around them, the park continued moving. Joggers passed. Leaves drifted from branches. Somewhere a dog barked near the pond. But Claire's attention narrowed entirely to the woman beside her, and what she didn't know was that less than a mile away, several men were already reaching for their phones. Because the moment Eleanor Marino collapsed on that bench, a chain of events quietly began that would change far more than either woman could possibly imagine. The ambulance lights painted flashes of red across the park entrance as Claire sat beside Eleanor in the emergency room waiting area, still holding the older woman's coat folded neatly across her lap. The hospital smelled faintly of disinfectant and burnt coffee, the familiar scent of long shifts and sleepless nights. Outside the window, afternoon sunlight reflected off rows of parked cars, but inside, time seemed to move differently. Eleanor had regained consciousness less than 20 minutes after arriving. The doctors called it dehydration combined with exhaustion. Nothing immediately life-threatening, nothing catastrophic, yet something about the incident refused to settle in Claire's mind. Eleanor looked too relieved when she woke up. Not relieved to be alive. Relieved to see Claire still sitting there. Most people called family after a scare. Most people had someone rushing through hospital doors, but no one came. No husband, no daughter, no son, no worried friend carrying flowers. Just silence. The kind of silence that seemed to follow Eleanor everywhere. By late afternoon, the hospital discharged her with instructions to rest and drink more water. Claire expected to help her into a taxi. Instead, She found herself driving across Brooklyn in her aging Honda while Eleanor sat quietly in the passenger seat. The neighborhood surprised her. The house was modest, white siding, small front porch, a narrow flower bed lined with fading autumn roses. It looked like the home of a retired school teacher, not someone connected to anything unusual. Claire helped her up the front steps. Inside, the house felt frozen in time. Family photographs sat on shelves. Old books lined the walls. A grandfather clock ticked softly from the corner of the living room. Everything was clean but lonely, as if only one person had lived there for years. "You do not have to stay," Eleanor said gently. Claire glanced toward the kitchen. "Have you eaten today?" Eleanor hesitated. That answer told her everything. 40 minutes later, soup simmered on the stove while Claire organized medication bottles and checked expiration dates. The evening sunlight stretched long shadows across the hardwood floor. For the first time since meeting her, Eleanor looked completely relaxed, she said quietly. Claire smiled while arranging groceries inside the refrigerator. "That sounds dangerous," Eleanor laughed softly. "Perhaps." The conversation drifted from one subject to another: childhood memories, favorite books, places they had always wanted to visit. Hours passed without either of them noticing. When Claire finally stood to leave, Eleanor reached into a drawer and removed an envelope. "At least let me pay you for today." Claire immediately shook her head. "No, you spent your entire afternoon helping me. I wanted to. People usually want something." Claire looked at the envelope, then back at the older woman. Maybe that is the problem. Eleanor studied her for a long moment before slowly placing the envelope back inside the drawer. Something unreadable passed across her expression. Gratitude, sadness, maybe both. By the time Claire stepped outside, darkness had settled over the neighborhood. Porch lights glowed along the quiet street. She walked toward her car and paused. Across the road, nearly half a block away, a black SUV sat parked beneath a street lamp. Its windows were dark. Its engine appeared to be running. Claire frowned. The vehicle looked expensive enough to belong in Manhattan rather than this quiet neighborhood. For a moment she considered it a coincidence. Then the headlights switched on, slowly, deliberately. The SUV remained exactly where it was, watching. Claire felt a brief chill despite the mild evening air. When she looked again, the vehicle finally pulled away and disappeared around the corner. She drove home telling herself it meant nothing. Unfortunately for her, at that exact moment, a photograph taken earlier that evening was being viewed inside another black SUV moving through Manhattan traffic, and the woman smiling beside Eleanor Marino was no longer a stranger. Rain arrived just after midnight and continued into the following morning, turning Brooklyn's sidewalks into ribbons of reflected light. Claire stood beneath the awning outside the assisted living center where she worked, watching commuters hurry through the drizzle with umbrellas tilted against the wind. Normally she would have headed straight home after her shift, but throughout the entire day she found herself thinking about Eleanor, about the empty house, about the untouched envelope, and about the black SUV parked beneath the street lamp. By 4 o'clock that afternoon, curiosity won again. She stopped at a small grocery store, picked up fresh bread, soup ingredients, and a bouquet of inexpensive white daisies before driving across town. The neighborhood looked different in the rain. Water dripped from gutters. Fallen leaves clung to the pavement. Eleanor answered the door before Claire could knock twice. "I had a feeling you would come back," she said with a smile. "That sounds suspiciously confident. At my age, confidence is simply experience." Claire laughed as she stepped inside. The warmth of the house immediately pushed away the damp chill from outdoors. Over the next hour, they settled into an easy routine. Claire cooked while Eleanor sat nearby describing stories from decades earlier. Not dramatic stories, small ones. Memories about old diners, neighborhood bakeries, summer parades, and people whose names had long disappeared from public memory. Listening to her felt like opening a forgotten photo album. Yet every time the conversation drifted toward family, Eleanor gently redirected it elsewhere. Claire noticed the pattern but chose not to push. Some wounds belonged to the people carrying them. As evening settled outside, rain tapped softly against the kitchen windows. Claire carried 2 bowls of soup to the dining table. That was when headlights briefly swept across the front curtains. Both women glanced toward the window. A vehicle had slowed in front of the house, then continued down the street. Eleanor's expression changed for only a fraction of a second before returning to normal, but Claire noticed. "Are you expecting someone?" she asked. "No." The answer came too quickly. Silence lingered between them. Later, while washing dishes, Claire happened to look through the small window above the sink. Across the street, parked beside a row of bare trees, sat another black SUV, not moving, not leaving, just waiting. A strange feeling settled in her chest. Not fear exactly. More like the sense that she had accidentally stepped into the edge of a story she did not understand. By 8 o'clock she prepared to leave. Eleanor walked her to the door despite Claire insisting she should rest. "You know," the older woman said softly, "most people are very busy. They say they will visit. Then life happens." Claire adjusted her coat. "I am not most people." Eleanor's eyes glistened with something deeper than gratitude. "No, I do not think you are." Outside, the rain had finally stopped. Streetlights reflected across wet pavement like liquid gold. Claire climbed into her car and started the engine. As she pulled away from the curb, she checked her rearview mirror. The black SUV remained parked exactly where it had been before. Yet the moment she reached the next intersection, it quietly rolled forward. Not fast, not aggressively, just enough for her to notice. She told herself she was imagining things. Unfortunately for her, several blocks away another vehicle was already receiving updates about her movements. And somewhere high above Manhattan, inside an office overlooking a skyline of glass and steel, a man she had never met was studying a photograph and asking a single question. "Who is Claire Dawson?" The following Saturday arrived wrapped in pale sunshine and unusually warm weather for late October. Claire spent the morning finishing errands before driving toward Eleanor's neighborhood with a small tray of seedlings balanced carefully on the passenger seat. The idea had come from a conversation earlier that week when Eleanor mentioned that she missed working in her garden but no longer had the energy to maintain it. When Claire pulled into the driveway, she found Eleanor already sitting on the back porch beneath a faded striped umbrella. The older woman smiled the moment she saw the plants. "You remembered. You mentioned wanting color before winter," Claire said, "so I brought reinforcements." The backyard was small but charming. A narrow stone path wound through flower beds that had once been carefully maintained. Autumn had claimed most of the blooms, leaving behind patches of brown stems and scattered leaves. Together they spent the afternoon planting. Claire worked while Eleanor supervised from a folding chair, occasionally pointing toward empty spaces that needed filling. The rhythm felt strangely peaceful. Dirt beneath fingernails, sunlight filtering through branches, the distant sound of children playing somewhere beyond the fence. For a few hours the mysteries surrounding Eleanor seemed far away, yet they never disappeared completely. Around noon, a black sedan drove slowly past the alley behind the property. It did not stop. It did not turn around. But Claire noticed the driver glance toward the house. Later, while carrying a watering can across the yard, she spotted another unfamiliar vehicle parked at the far end of the street. The same feeling returned, not fear, observation. As though invisible eyes lingered just beyond sight, Eleanor seemed to notice her attention drifting. "You are thinking too much," she said. Claire laughed. "Occupational hazard. No, that is something else." Claire sat on the edge of the porch railing. "Can I ask you something you can answer?" Eleanor smiled knowingly. "That depends." Claire looked toward the quiet street beyond the fence. "Is someone watching this house?" For a brief moment the breeze carried only the rustling of leaves. Eleanor folded her hands together. "Everyone is watched by someone, dear. That is not really an answer. No, it is not." Claire shook her head and smiled despite herself. Getting a direct answer from Eleanor sometimes felt like chasing sunlight through moving clouds. The afternoon stretched comfortably onward. As shadows lengthened across the yard, Eleanor began sharing stories from decades earlier. Not details, fragments. A summer road trip across the country, a Christmas spent in Chicago during a snowstorm, a young boy who once hated vegetables but loved baseball. Claire listened carefully. It was the first time Eleanor had spoken about family at all. "Your son?" she asked gently. Eleanor nodded. "My son." Her voice softened around the words. "Do you see him often?" Another pause. Another silence filled with meanings Claire could not fully understand. "Not as often as either of us should." Something sad flickered behind Eleanor's eyes before disappearing again. Claire did not press further. She simply sat beside her while the afternoon light turned golden across the garden. Several minutes passed before Eleanor spoke again. "Tell me something, Claire." "What? Do you believe people deserve second chances?" The question seemed oddly carefully. "Most people do, even after mistakes. Depends on the mistake." Eleanor studied her for a long moment. "And if someone carried regret for many years?" Claire looked toward the flowers they had planted together. "Then I think they deserve the chance to become better than the person they used to be." Eleanor's eyes glistened slightly in the fading sunlight. She looked away before Claire could read the emotion fully. Unfortunately for Claire, she did not realize that her answer mattered far more than she imagined, because less than 24 hours later, someone would finally decide it was time to learn everything there was to know about the woman sitting beside Eleanor Marino. 3 days later, the city disappeared beneath a curtain of cold November rain. Water streamed down office windows, gathered in gutters, and turned every streetlight into a blurred halo of gold. Claire finished her shift shortly after sunset and stepped into the damp evening, carrying a small bag of groceries she planned to bring to Eleanor the next morning. The parking lot outside the assisted living center was nearly empty. Most employees had already gone home. The distant hum of traffic drifted through the rain as she unlocked her car and settled behind the wheel. For a moment, she simply sat there listening to raindrops tap against the windshield. It had been a long week, residents needing extra care, double shifts, bills waiting at home. Yet somehow the thought of visiting Eleanor tomorrow brought a small sense of peace. She started the engine and pulled onto the road. Rain blurred the city into moving reflections. Storefront signs glowed across wet pavement. Headlights streaked past like ribbons of white light. The drive home should have taken 20 minutes. Instead, traffic forced her through unfamiliar side streets. Claire followed her navigation app through a quieter section of Brooklyn lined with warehouses and aging brick buildings. The neighborhood was not dangerous, just empty. Most businesses had already closed for the night. As she approached an intersection, flashing hazard lights appeared ahead. A delivery truck sat partially across one lane. Several vehicles were backed up behind it. Claire sighed and turned onto a side street to avoid the delay. The road narrowed. Rain intensified. For several blocks she saw no other cars. Then her phone buzzed, a message from work. She glanced down for barely a second before returning her attention to the road. Ahead, a large piece of debris had washed into the lane during the storm. Claire hit the brakes immediately. Her tires slipped briefly against the wet pavement before regaining traction. The car stopped safely several feet away. Her pulse quickened. Nothing had happened. Yet for a moment her heart hammered loudly enough to drown out the rain. She exhaled and gripped the steering wheel. Okay, she whispered to herself. That was close. What she did not know was that another vehicle had already noticed the same hazard nearly 2 minutes earlier. Less than half a mile away, inside a dark SUV moving through the neighborhood, a driver quietly spoke into a hands-free headset. The conversation lasted less than 10 seconds. By the time Claire carefully maneuvered around the obstruction and continued home, city maintenance workers had unexpectedly arrived to clear the roadway. The timing felt strangely fortunate. The following morning, sunlight broke through heavy clouds for the first time all week. Claire drove to Eleanor's house carrying groceries and a container of homemade soup. She found the older woman sitting near the front window reading a novel. "You look tired," Eleanor observed after one glance. "Long week. You should take better care of yourself," Claire laughed. "That sounds familiar." They spent most of the morning talking while sunlight filled the living room. The house felt warmer than usual, more alive. At one point, Claire mentioned the near accident from the previous evening. Eleanor listened quietly without interrupting. When Claire finished, the older woman's expression softened with unmistakable relief. "I am glad you made it home safely," she said. The sincerity in her voice felt unusually intense. Before Claire could respond, movement outside the window caught her attention. Across the street, a man stood beside a parked vehicle, speaking briefly into a phone. The moment he noticed the house, he turned away and walked back toward his car. Claire frowned. Something about the encounter felt familiar, like another piece of a puzzle she could almost see but could not yet understand. And somewhere beyond the city, a security camera recording from the previous night was quietly disappearing from a digital archive before anyone ever thought to review it. November settled deeper over the city during the following week. The trees outside Eleanor's house had surrendered most of their leaves, leaving dark branches stretched against pale grey skies. Claire found herself visiting more often than she originally intended. What had begun as concern after a chance meeting in the park now felt like something closer to family. On Thursday afternoon, she arrived carrying takeout from a small diner Eleanor liked. The house was unusually quiet when she stepped inside. No music, no television. Only the soft ticking of the grandfather clock echoing through the hallway. "Eleanor," she called. "In the kitchen, dear." Claire followed the voice and immediately noticed something different. Several old photo albums lay open across the table. Faded photographs covered the surface like scattered pieces of another lifetime. Eleanor sat beside them with reading glasses resting low on her nose. Sunlight filtered through the window above her shoulder, illuminating tiny particles of dust drifting through the air. "Well," Eleanor said with a smile, "I suppose it was time to organize a few memories." Claire set the food down and pulled out a chair. For nearly an hour they looked through photographs together. Young couples standing beside classic cars, family vacations near lakes, birthday parties, Christmas mornings. The images felt warm and ordinary, yet one thing stood out. In almost every photograph where a child appeared, the face had either been turned away from the camera or partially hidden by distance. At first, Claire assumed it was coincidence. Then she noticed it again and again. "You are doing that on purpose," she finally said. Eleanor looked amused. "Doing what?" "Showing me photographs without actually showing me the person in them." The older woman laughed quietly. "You notice everything. Occupational hazard. There is that phrase again." Claire studied one particular photograph. A little boy standing near a baseball field beneath summer sunshine. His face was mostly hidden by the brim of a cap. "Your son," Eleanor nodded. "My son." The answer carried both affection and sadness. Claire waited. For once, Eleanor did not change the subject immediately. Instead, she traced the edge of the photograph with one finger. "He was a good boy, was?" "He still is," Eleanor corrected herself gently. Life simply became complicated. The room fell silent. Outside, wind rattled branches against the side of the house. Claire sensed there was more beneath the words, much more. "Do you see him at all?" she asked. Eleanor looked toward the window. "Sometimes. Does he live nearby?" Another pause. "Closer than he realizes." Claire frowned slightly. The answer made little sense, yet somehow felt important. As afternoon slipped toward evening, they moved into the living room. Eleanor seemed more reflective than usual, less guarded. The conversation wandered through memories and regrets and second chances. Eventually, Eleanor set down her teacup and turned toward Claire with unusual seriousness. "May I ask you something?" "Of course. If someone spent years building walls around themselves, do you think those walls can ever come down?" Claire considered the question carefully. "Only if they want them to." Eleanor nodded slowly. "And if they forgot how?" "Then maybe they need someone patient enough to remind them." For a moment, emotion flickered across the older woman's face. Relief, hope, something deeper. Before Claire could identify it, headlights suddenly swept across the front windows. Both women turned toward the street. The sound of engines drifted through the quiet neighborhood. Not one vehicle, several. Eleanor's expression changed immediately. Not fear, recognition. Claire rose and moved closer to the window. At the far end of the block, dark vehicles had begun turning onto the street one after another. Their glossy black surfaces reflected the fading light of sunset, and as the convoy slowly approached the house, Claire realized she was about to meet the one person Eleanor had never been willing to name. The engines grew louder as the convoy rolled deeper into the neighborhood. Claire remained near the window while Eleanor sat perfectly still in her armchair. The fading light of sunset reflected across the glass, painting the living room in shades of gold and amber. One by one, the vehicles slowed before the house. Their dark exteriors gleamed beneath the streetlights that had just begun to flicker awake. No sirens. Just quiet precision, the kind that made every movement seem deliberate. Claire counted 4 vehicles before the lead SUV came to a stop directly in front of the property. For several seconds, nothing happened. Then a rear passenger door opened. A tall man stepped onto the sidewalk. Even from inside the house, his presence seemed to change the atmosphere around him. He wore a charcoal overcoat over a dark suit tailored with effortless precision. His posture was relaxed, yet there was something unmistakably controlled about the way he moved, like someone accustomed to being observed. The porch light illuminated sharp features, dark hair touched by the evening breeze, and calm eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. The older woman was already smiling, not the polite smile she offered neighbors or grocery clerks. Something deeper, more personal, more vulnerable. "Your son," Claire said quietly. Eleanor nodded. "My son." For a moment neither woman moved. Then the front door opened before either of them reached it. The man stepped inside. The scent of cold autumn air followed him into the house. He looked first at Eleanor. Nothing else seemed to exist. The years between them disappeared in a single glance. "Mom," his voice was low and steady. Eleanor rose slowly from her chair. "You took your time." A faint smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. "Traffic," the answer made her laugh softly. The tension in the room eased instantly. He crossed the distance and wrapped his arms around her in a careful embrace. Not dramatic, not emotional. Yet Claire noticed how his shoulders relaxed the moment he held her. She noticed how Eleanor closed her eyes briefly as if reassuring herself he was truly there. When they stepped apart, he finally turned toward Claire. The room suddenly felt much smaller. "Claire Dawson," he said. "Not a question, a statement." Claire blinked. "You know my name?" "Yes." His gaze remained calm, observant. "You have been helping my mother." Claire looked from him to Eleanor. "I did not realize introductions had already happened." Something unreadable flickered across Eleanor's face before disappearing. The man extended his hand. "Rafael Marino." Claire shook it. His grip was firm but respectful. "Nice to finally meet you." Finally, the word slipped out before she could stop it. For the briefest moment, amusement appeared in his eyes. "My mother talks about you often." Eleanor immediately looked pleased with herself. "That is true." Claire felt warmth rise into her cheeks and quickly changed the subject. Over the next hour they shared dinner around the kitchen table. The dynamic fascinated her. Raphael listened more than he spoke. When Eleanor told stories, he paid attention. When she repeated details, he never corrected her. When she laughed, he seemed to relax. The contrast surprised Claire. Nothing about him matched the image she had imagined during months of mystery, yet questions continued to gather in the back of her mind. The vehicles, the strangers, the constant watchfulness surrounding the house. As the evening ended, Claire prepared to leave. Raphael walked her to the front porch while Eleanor cleaned dishes inside. The night air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant chimney smoke. "Thank you," Raphael said unexpectedly. "For what?" "For being there when I could not." Claire studied him carefully. There was sincerity in his voice, real gratitude. But there was also something else, a weight she could not yet identify. Before she could respond, one of the waiting vehicles pulled slowly toward the curb. The driver remained inside, the engine never turned off. Claire looked at the convoy lined along the quiet street. Then back at Raphael. For the first time she realized that whatever world he belonged to was far larger than the one she understood. And standing beneath the porch light, she had the unmistakable feeling that she had only just stepped through the first door. The following week passed with an unexpected change in rhythm. Raphael began appearing more often, not every day, not even regularly. Yet somehow his presence slowly became part of the landscape surrounding Eleanor's life. Sometimes Claire would arrive to find fresh groceries already stocked in the kitchen. Other times a contractor would be repairing something Eleanor had casually mentioned weeks earlier. A broken porch step, a leaking faucet, a damaged fence panel. Problems seemed to disappear before they could become inconveniences. One bright November morning, Claire arrived carrying a basket of muffins from a neighborhood bakery and found Eleanor standing near the front window. "You look pleased about something," Claire said. Eleanor smiled. "Perhaps I am." Before Claire could ask what she meant, a black sedan pulled into the driveway. Moments later, Raphael stepped out. Sunlight reflected across the windshield behind him as he walked toward the house, carrying a folder tucked beneath one arm. There was nothing dramatic about the entrance. Yet Claire noticed how naturally everyone around him seemed to move. The driver remained inside the vehicle. Another car waited farther down the street, quiet, patient, always present. Raphael entered the house and greeted his mother before turning toward Claire. "Good morning. You are becoming difficult to avoid," Claire replied. A rare smile appeared. "I will try harder." Eleanor laughed from across the room. The sound immediately softened the atmosphere. Later that afternoon, after lunch, Raphael offered to drive Claire back toward Brooklyn since he was heading into Manhattan. She hesitated before accepting. The city skyline shimmered in the distance as they crossed the bridge. Sunlight reflected off glass towers rising above the river. Traffic moved steadily beneath a clear blue sky. For several miles neither spoke much. Surprisingly, the silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Then Claire noticed something unusual. The vehicle ahead of them moved when they moved. Another followed behind at a consistent distance. "Do all your trips look like this?" she asked. Raphael glanced through the windshield. "Like what?" "Like you are traveling with an entire parade." A faint trace of amusement crossed his face. "Occupational habit." "That sounds expensive." "It probably is." The answer revealed nothing while somehow confirming everything. 20 minutes later, they arrived in Lower Manhattan. Claire expected to be dropped off near a subway station. Instead, Raphael's phone rang. After a brief conversation, he turned toward her. "I need to stop by the office for a few minutes. Then I can take the train." "You can." He paused. "Or you can see what all the mystery is about." Curiosity won. 10 minutes later, they entered one of the most impressive buildings Claire had ever seen. Marble floors stretched across a lobby larger than some apartment buildings. Glass elevators climbed toward the clouds. Employees greeted Raphael by name the moment he stepped respectfully. Executives interrupted meetings to speak with him. Security personnel nodded as he passed. Every interaction revealed the same thing: influence, authority, reach. Claire followed quietly, trying not to stare. From the top floor, the entire city unfolded beyond floor-to-ceiling windows. Rivers of traffic, endless towers, the distant outline of Brooklyn beneath pale afternoon light. "You own all this?" she asked before realizing how absurd the question sounded. Raphael looked out across the skyline. Not all of it. The answer was simple, yet somehow even more revealing. During the next hour, Claire witnessed fragments of a world she had never imagined. Corporate meetings, real estate discussions, charitable foundations, development projects. Everywhere she looked, Raphael's name seemed connected to something larger, more powerful, more complicated. By the time she finally left the building, one realization had become impossible to ignore. Eleanor's son was not simply successful. He occupied an entirely different universe from the one Claire had always known, and as she stepped onto the crowded Manhattan sidewalk, she found herself wondering a far more dangerous question. If this was only the part of his world that everyone could see, what exactly was hidden behind the doors that remained closed? The invitation arrived 2 days later, envelope resting beside Eleanor's teacup. Claire almost ignored it. Almost. The card inside was elegant without being flashy. A charity gala benefiting children's education programs across New York City. Hosted by one of Raphael's foundations. "You should go," Eleanor says immediately. Claire looked up from the card. "I do not belong at events like this. Nonsense. People there probably spend more on shoes than I spend on rent." Eleanor smiled over the rim of her teacup, then wear comfortable shoes and surprise them. Somehow, against her better judgment, Claire agreed. The gala occupied the grand ballroom of a historic Manhattan hotel overlooking the river. Crystal chandeliers filled the ceiling with warm golden light. Live music drifted through the air. Guests moved between tables, dressed in designer gowns and tailored suits. Claire felt out of place the moment she stepped inside. She had borrowed a simple navy dress from a co-worker and spent the entire subway ride regretting her decision to attend. Then she spotted Raphael across the room. The reaction surprised her. Relief settled into her chest before she could stop it. He stood near a group of executives and city officials, speaking calmly while others listened. Not because he was loud, quite the opposite. The room seemed to bend naturally toward him. Several people approached him throughout the evening, business leaders, philanthropists, community organizers. Every conversation ended the same way: respect, influence, access. Claire slowly realized that Raphael's world stretched much farther than office towers and private drivers. He seemed connected to everyone. "You look like you are conducting an investigation." His voice appeared beside her unexpectedly. Claire turned and laughed softly. "Maybe I am, and what have you discovered? That half the city seems to know you." A faint smile touched his face. "Only half?" For the next hour they moved through the event together. Raphael introduced her to teachers, non-profit directors, and hospital administrators. Unlike many wealthy guests, he never spoke about himself. He asked questions, remembered details, listened carefully. The more Claire observed him, the more complicated her assumptions became. Yet something still felt hidden beneath the surface. The answer arrived shortly before 10 o'clock. Claire had stepped onto a quieter balcony overlooking the river. Cold air drifted in from the water below. Manhattan glittered beneath the night sky. She intended to spend only a moment outside. Instead, voices carried from the far end of the balcony. Two men stood partially hidden near a stone column. One spoke in a low voice. "Marino keeps the entire operation running." The other nodded. "Always has." Claire frowned. Operation. The word caught her attention. "Nobody moves anything significant in this city without his approval." The second man laughed quietly. "That is why nobody crosses him." Claire remained perfectly still. The conversation continued for less than 30 seconds before both men returned inside. Yet the pieces suddenly aligned. The constant security, the black vehicles, the invisible protection, the influence, the unanswered questions. She looked through the ballroom windows toward Raphael. At that exact moment, he was speaking with a group of guests near the stage. Calm, polished, respected. But now Claire saw him differently, not simply as a businessman. Not simply as Eleanor's devoted son. Something much larger existed beneath the surface. Something powerful enough that people lowered their voices when discussing it. Later that evening, she searched his name online during the subway ride home. Most articles described a successful entrepreneur and philanthropist, yet scattered among them were rumors, speculation, investigations that never reached conclusions, references to organized crime connections that could never quite be proven. By the time the train emerged from the tunnel into Brooklyn, Claire stared silently at her phone screen. The city lights reflected across the glass like distant stars, and for the first time since meeting Rafael Marino, she wondered whether the man she was beginning to trust might also be the one person she should fear. The days following the gala felt different, not because anything obvious had changed, but because Claire could no longer ignore the questions occupying her mind. Every conversation with Rafael now carried a second layer beneath the surface. Every black vehicle, every carefully timed appearance, every unexplained convenience. She tried convincing herself that rumors were only rumors. New York was full of successful people surrounded by speculation, yet the uncertainty remained. On a grey Saturday morning, she visited Eleanor earlier than usual. Winter clouds hung low over the city, turning the sky into a sheet of silver. The house felt quieter than normal. Eleanor sat near the fireplace, wrapped in a soft blanket, reading one of her favorite novels. The moment Claire entered, the older woman noticed the tension she was trying to hide. "Something is bothering you." Claire set down a bag of groceries. "You always know. That is because you make the same face every time you are thinking too hard." Despite herself, Claire smiled. For a while they talked about ordinary things, neighborhood news, holiday decorations appearing across the city, a bakery opening nearby, yet eventually the conversation drifted toward Rafael. It always seemed to. "He was not always like this," Eleanor said quietly. Claire looked up. "Like what?" "Careful." The answer surprised her. Eleanor stared into the fire. When he was younger, he believed he could solve every problem by carrying it himself. The flames reflected softly in her eyes. "That usually ends badly." It did. Claire waited. For once, Eleanor seemed willing to continue. Years ago, he made a decision. He thought he was protecting people. Instead, innocent families suffered consequences he never intended. The room fell silent except for the crackling fireplace. "What happened?" Claire asked gently. Eleanor shook her head. But the sadness in her voice revealed enough. Regret, not scandal, not cruelty, regret. Later that afternoon, after leaving the house, Claire found herself thinking about the conversation long after the city swallowed her into its usual noise. Curiosity eventually pushed her somewhere she had not planned to go. A public archive connected to a local newspaper maintained decades of old articles. Most people never visited. The building stood between a church and a law office in Lower Manhattan. Quiet, forgotten. Rain tapped softly against the windows as Claire searched through digital records. At first she found nothing unusual. Business acquisitions, charity donations, real estate projects. Then an article from nearly 10 years earlier caught her attention. It described a development dispute involving several neighborhoods and multiple companies. One name appeared repeatedly: Rafael Marino. According to the report, decisions made during the project had unintentionally displaced dozens of residents. Families lost homes. Small businesses disappeared. The situation had eventually been corrected. Compensation had been provided. New housing had been built. Yet the damage had already happened. Claire stared at the screen. There were no accusations of crimes, no dramatic revelations, only evidence of a man whose choices had carried consequences larger than he anticipated. A man who had spent years trying to repair something he could never fully undo. The discovery unsettled her more than any rumor. Because mistakes felt human, regret felt real. That evening Rafael called unexpectedly. His voice remained calm as always. "My mother said you seemed distracted today." Claire looked through her apartment window toward the lights of Brooklyn glowing against the dark. "Maybe I learned something." Silence lingered briefly between them. "Not uncomfortable, careful, and?" Rafael asked. Claire closed her eyes. "I think you have been carrying guilt for a very long time." The line remained silent for several seconds. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded quieter than she had ever heard it. "Some things stay with you." Before Claire could answer, another call interrupted the conversation. Across the city, Eleanor Marino had just been rushed to the hospital. Snow began falling before dawn. Thin flakes drifted across Manhattan, softening the city beneath a blanket of white and silver. Claire barely remembered the drive to the hospital. One moment she had been standing in her apartment holding her phone. The next she was pushing through automatic doors into a private medical wing filled with muted lighting and hushed voices. The atmosphere felt different from any hospital she had ever visited. Quiet, controlled, Several familiar black vehicles sat outside beneath the falling snow. Inside, men in dark coats stood discreetly along hallways, speaking in low voices, yet none of that mattered. Claire's attention found Raphael immediately. He stood alone near a window overlooking the city. The glow of early morning reflected against the glass behind him. For the first time since she had met him, he looked exhausted, not physically, emotionally. Like a man carrying something far heavier than himself. He turned when he heard her approach. Neither spoke for a moment. Words felt too small for the space between them. Finally, Claire asked the only question that mattered. "How is she?" Raphael looked toward the floor before answering. "She has known for almost a year." Claire stared at him. "Known what?" His jaw tightened slightly. "That she was running out of time." The words landed like cold stone. Suddenly, dozens of memories rearranged themselves inside Claire's mind. The conversations about second chances, the photo albums, the questions about regret, the unusual urgency hidden beneath Eleanor's kindness. She had known. All along she had known. "Why did she never tell me?" Claire whispered. "Because she did not want to spend her remaining time being treated like a patient." Raphael looked back toward the hospital room. She wanted to be treated like herself. Through the partially open doorway, Claire could see Eleanor resting peacefully beneath soft white blankets. Winter sunlight touched the edge of the bed. The room looked less like a hospital room and more like a quiet place suspended between seasons. Later that afternoon, Eleanor woke fully. Her voice was weak and remained unchanged. "You both look terrible," she announced. Claire laughed through tears she had been trying to hide. Raphael shook his head. "You are impossible. That is what makes life interesting." For several hours they sat together. No dramatic speeches, no desperate conversations, just stories, memories, laughter. The kind of moments people never realize are precious until they become rare. As evening settled outside, snow continued falling beyond the windows. City lights appeared one by one across the skyline. Eventually, Eleanor asked Raphael to step into the hallway so she could speak with Claire alone. The moment the door closed, the older woman reached toward the drawer beside her bed. She removed a sealed envelope. Claire immediately recognized her handwriting. "What is this?" she asked softly. "Something for later." Eleanor placed the envelope into her hands. "Not today." Claire felt her throat tighten. "Promise me." The older woman's voice remained gentle but firm. "When the time comes, you will read it." Claire nodded. "I promise." Eleanor smiled and settled back against the pillow. "Good." For a while neither spoke. Snowflakes drifted past the window like tiny stars. The hospital room glowed with warm light, peaceful, fragile. Then Eleanor turned her head slightly and looked toward the door where Raphael had disappeared. "He still believes some mistakes cannot be forgiven," she said quietly. Claire followed her gaze. "Maybe he is wrong." A faint smile appeared. "I hope so." Outside the room, Raphael stood alone in the hallway, staring at the falling snow beyond the glass. And neither of them knew that the letter resting in Claire's hands contained the final truth Eleanor had been protecting from the very beginning. The snow stopped 2 days later. The city remained covered in white, but the sky had cleared into a pale winter blue that felt almost cruel in its beauty. Eleanor Marino passed away quietly before sunrise. There were no dramatic final words, no last-minute revelations, only peace. The kind of peace that arrives when someone has already made peace with their own story. The funeral took place at the end of the week. A cold rain replaced the snow, tapping softly against umbrellas gathered beneath grey skies. Claire stood near the back of the small cemetery service, holding a single white rose. She noticed people arriving from every corner of New York. Business leaders, community organizers, teachers, nurses, elderly neighbors, families she had never seen before. The line of mourners seemed endless. Each carried a different memory, a different story, yet they all spoke about the same thing. Eleanor's kindness, her patience, her ability to make people feel seen. Raphael stood near the front throughout the ceremony, dressed in black, silent, composed. From a distance he appeared unshakable, but Claire had learned enough by then to recognize the difference between strength and grief. The rain collected along his coat collar, he never seemed to notice. After the service ended, guests slowly disappeared into waiting vehicles. The cemetery grew quiet. Eventually only Claire and Raphael remained beside the fresh flowers. Neither spoke for several minutes. The silence belonged to Eleanor somehow. Finally, Raphael looked toward the horizon. "She liked you immediately." Claire smiled sadly. She hid it well. A faint laugh escaped him. "No, she talked about you constantly." The admission caught her off guard. Before she could respond, Raphael reached into his coat pocket and removed a folded piece of paper. The hospital gave me this after. His voice faded briefly. She left instructions. Claire stared at the familiar handwriting. I have one too. That evening they met at Eleanor's house for the first time since her passing. The rooms felt different, not empty, just quieter, as if the house itself understood someone important was missing. Rain tapped gently against the windows while they sat across from each other in the living room. The grandfather clock continued its steady rhythm from the corner. Claire finally opened the envelope Eleanor had given her. The letter inside was several pages long. She began reading silently. By the second paragraph, tears blurred the words. Eleanor had written about loneliness, about unexpected friendships, about how life sometimes sends people into each other's paths for reasons that only become clear later. Then came the truth. She had known she was dying before Claire ever sat beside her on that park bench. She had recognized immediately that Claire's kindness was genuine, no agenda, no desire for reward, just kindness. Eleanor wrote that she had spent years worrying about her son, not because he lacked success, not because he lacked power, but because he had forgotten how to let people close enough to know him. Then came the final passage, the one that stole the breath from Claire's lungs. Eleanor admitted she had hoped they would meet, not because she wanted to arrange their future, not because she believed in fairy tales. She simply believed they each carried something the other needed. Claire lowered the letter slowly. Across the room, Raphael finished reading his own copy. The silence that followed felt different from every silence before it. Softer, honest. She planned this, Claire whispered. Raphael looked down at the pages in his hands. Not all of it. His voice remained quiet. She just opened a door. Rain continued falling outside. The house glowed with warm lamplight. Memories seemed to linger in every room. After a long moment, Raphael stood and walked toward the front window. Claire joined him. Together they looked out at the dark street where black vehicles still waited at a respectful distance. Do you know what she told me in the hospital? Claire asked. No, she said you still believe some mistakes cannot be forgiven. Raphael remained silent. I think she spent her last year trying to prove you wrong. For the first time, the walls Claire had sensed around him since the beginning seemed to crack. Not dramatically, just enough for the truth to emerge. And standing beside the window where Eleanor had spent so many evenings watching the street, neither of them noticed that the storm outside had finally begun to pass. Winter eventually gave way to spring. The transformation happened slowly, almost invisibly at first. Snow disappeared from sidewalks. Trees that had stood bare for months began showing hints of green. The city emerged from the cold with the cautious optimism of something waking from a long sleep. For Claire, the months following Eleanor's passing felt much the same. There were difficult days. Days when she instinctively reached for her phone to share something Eleanor would have enjoyed. Days when she passed the park bench and felt the absence before she remembered the reason. But there were also unexpected moments of peace. Small reminders that grief and gratitude could exist together. Fao remained part of her life, not through grand gestures, not through expensive gifts. In fact, the biggest change came from what he stopped doing. He stopped trying to solve every problem. He stopped turning every inconvenience into a project. Instead, he showed up, sometimes with coffee, sometimes with dinner after a long shift, sometimes with nothing at all except time. The adjustment did not happen overnight. More than once, Claire caught him trying to carry burdens alone. More than once, he caught her refusing help because she believed she had to earn everything she received. Yet little by little, the walls Eleanor had spoken about continued to disappear. One warm April afternoon, Raphael asked Claire to meet him after work. He refused to explain why. That usually means trouble, she told him over the phone. This time it means a walk. You are becoming mysterious. I learned from my mother. By late afternoon, the city glowed beneath clear skies and soft sunlight. Claire found him waiting near the entrance of the same park where everything had begun months earlier. The air smelled of fresh grass and blooming flowers. Children laughed near the pond. Couples sat beneath newly green trees. Life had returned to every corner of the park. Together they walked familiar paths without speaking much. Neither seemed in a hurry to reach their destination. Eventually they arrived at the large maple tree overlooking the water. Claire stopped immediately. The bench was still there, restored and polished. A small memorial plaque had been placed discreetly beneath the seat. Eleanor Marino, beloved mother, loyal friend, a kind heart never truly leaves. For a moment neither moved. Spring sunlight filtered through the branches above them. The pond reflected ribbons of gold across the surface. Claire sat down first. Raphael joined her. Between them rested a bouquet of white flowers, the same kind Eleanor had always loved. She would have hated everyone making a fuss, Claire said softly. Raphael smiled. Absolutely. Silence settled comfortably around them. Not empty, full, the kind of silence shared by people who no longer need to fill every moment with words. After a while, Raphael reached into his coat pocket. Claire immediately recognized the nervousness behind the gesture. It looked strangely out of place on a man who usually seemed prepared for everything. He held out a small box, not extravagant, not dramatic. Simple, honest. I spent months trying to figure out the perfect speech, he admitted. Then I realized my mother would probably tell me to stop overthinking. Claire laughed through sudden tears. That sounds exactly right. Raphael looked toward the pond before meeting her eyes again. For a long time I thought redemption meant fixing every mistake I had ever made. His voice remained quiet. She taught me that sometimes redemption begins by allowing yourself to be loved despite them. The ring caught the sunlight as he opened the box. Claire Dawson, would you spend the rest of your life with me? Tears blurred her vision completely now. Yet the answer felt simple, as natural as the changing seasons around them. Yes. The word carried no hesitation, no uncertainty, only truth. Somewhere above them, wind moved gently through the branches of the maple tree, the same tree that had once watched an elderly woman sit alone on a bench waiting for company. Now the bench held something different. Two people, a bouquet of white flowers, a future chosen freely, and beneath the warm light of spring, where loneliness had once lived, only love remained.